Welcome to New England Youth Theater. My name is Jerry Stockman. I work here at NEYT, and thanks for turning out for tonight's event. I was going to say show, but it's not really a show. I'm not sure what to call it except an evening of swapping stories. And actually, I have a couple, if you have a minute. Everybody got time? Yeah? Oh, good. So as I said, I work here, and about 5 or 6 weeks ago, I was slated to go to a production meeting for the show that we're about to open, A Fiddler on the Roof. And it was a design meeting. We were talking about the set. The invitees were myself and my colleague Rick Barron, and the director of the show, Stephen Stearns, whom I'm sure you're all familiar with. And the night before, I'm thinking about the meeting, and I think, oh my goodness. Here I am at a meeting about Fiddler, the only Jew, and I have these two Goysher boys with me. And I feel this sudden sense of responsibility about having to educate them about Fiddler. Having a shared experience of being the son of a Russian Jew who came here when he was 7 in 1914, when his family decided that the choice between either being a revolutionary or being in the Tsar's army, not so good, so I think we'll find someplace else. And I sat down and I put together a slideshow. I wanted the representative art that had influence on the show. Mark Chagall, of course, who illustrated Shalom Aleichem's book, in which the story of Tevye and his daughters was included. Boris Aronson, who designed the original set for Fiddler, who was a remarkable artist in his own right. A lot of art from the period and a lot of photographs of shtetls, of Russian Jewish villages and towns where these people came from. So we had our meeting, we put together this, I presented the slideshow, and we talked for a long time about the experience of Fiddler, what it felt like to be uprooted, to have your entire life and your family go from one place to another, and what's left behind after that experience. And to illustrate it, I told my dad's story. He was 7, as I said, in 1914, and the family came to the US in a very traditional way. A bachelor uncle was elected to be the first to go. My great uncle Pinchas, who became Philip, thanks to Ellis Island, and came to the US, got a job, established a community, figured out where everyone can live, and then he sent for the rest of the family. They came from a village in the Ukraine called Korets. They traveled by horse and cart from Korets to Odessa, from which they sailed. This, again, was in 1914. And unfortunately, at that time, parenting skills weren't what we're used to today. And because your departure from town wasn't something that you broadcast, and because my dad was a little pisher and he was only 7 years old, and who's going to share details with that guy? All he knew was they were going, and it was very exciting to him. It was a big deal. And he remembers the day that they left, by horse and wagon, driven by my great-great-uncle, the only redhead in the family. My father remembered that very clearly. The one thing his parents forgot to mention was that the family dog wouldn't be coming to America. And my dad didn't realize that until he was on the cart. They were riding away from Korets, and the dog was chasing the cart. And he turned back, and his last image of that town was the dog and him crying his eyes out. And he carried that with him his whole life, and told that story to me when I was probably 7 years old. And so I told that story at this meeting, and I look up, and the two other participants are starting to tear up. And that was the genesis of the idea for this evening. Rick Barron, after that meeting, I think became absolutely dedicated to providing this opportunity for us to sit and do what we're doing now, tell stories about this particular theme. So I want to thank Rick for gathering up the the impetus and the energy for doing that. And I'd like to invite him to introduce the rest of the evening. Thanks very much.
This story of Jerry's just wouldn't let me go, and I almost went twice around the mountain before the whole thing had sort of synthesized into, yeah, stories from the shtetl. So I came back here. Jerry isn't the only Jewish person in this place. He was the only Jewish person at the meeting. So when I walked into the lobby the next day and said, how about an evening of stories from the shtetl, there was a, whoo, wow, in Yiddish. And then they all looked at me and said, what shtetl, Rick? And I said, well, you know, I have some stories that can fit into that category. So anyway, the name of the evening evolved into No Lasting Home, Stories of Displacement and Diaspora. And later on in the evening, you will hear where the No Lasting Home comes from and why I am in this storytelling business today. So my job here is to set the scene for the evening, and it came out of the idea of a fundraiser for other nonprofits, and particularly at this time of the year, social service agencies, homeless, youth services. We are youth theater. We are very close to many youths, some in good circumstances, some in not. And we also are beginning to get increasing numbers of people from Greenfield and from Keene. So for our 3 recipients of your donations for this evening, in lieu of ticket prices, was to give money to youth services here in Brattleboro, and I believe also in Bellows Falls. Am I right about that? Anyway, youth services in Brattleboro and Keene Community Kitchen, who have not been able to send a representative tonight, and ServiceNet Greenfield Family Inn. All of these organizations have been, 2 of them have not been able to send representatives tonight because they have so many fundraisers for them going on that they all are attending, thank heavens, because at this time of the year that need is great. And so that is, we decided to dedicate this particular evening to those charities. And I'll just say a couple of words about the whole notion of diaspora and what the other one? Displacement. Thank you, displacement. Diaspora is a huge term of mass movements of hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of people, usually a forced expulsion, political war, genocide, ethnic cleansing. Diasporas used to happen before for natural reasons like floods and ice sheets coming across the continents. But it wasn't until mankind sort of settled into communities and built prosperous villages and agriculture and houses and stuff that diaspora and ethnic cleansing became worthwhile for those who wanted to do it, because here was a prosperous place and they've got farms and fields and animals. We could just push them out of here and take over, and they've done the hard work for us. So it became a political and a nationalistic, militaristic enterprise. And we all know about the immense cruelties that have been done to so many nationalities and ethnicities and religions. But there are also small homelessness in Brattleboro is perhaps not a diaspora, but it's certainly a displacement for those involved. It only requires one person in one family to be homeless for many reasons, and we're about to hear 2 short letters from 2 girls here in the Brattleboro area which kind of illustrate that, to show that this is a huge problem, and is also a huge problem on a tiny scale, a personal, individual scale. And we have a number of stories tonight from people who have gone through large disruptions and have a small memento of that was very dear to them. There's one particular story there. There is a story of kindness, of taking in strangers, of taking in people whom you don't know, and hiding them for 5 years virtually in your village in Italy. We will see that on the DVD. There are so many different stories, and I'm not going to blab on about them because you want to hear them from the individuals. So I will hand over, I will just say again that at intermission, we will have lots of lovely refreshments out there, and all donations for refreshments and any other donations are all going to those charities this evening, and this is a good time of the year to be doing that. So we have 2 letters to be read by my daughter Robin and by Irene Shamus from 2 people at the at Youth Services in Brattleboro. I have a little personal story about that even, which is that our phone number at home is only 1 digit. It's 2 digits reversed from Youth Services. And we're very familiar at home with the 2:30 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon time period when the phone starts to ring, and it's often a wrong number, and it's often someone in distress. You can tell. Maybe they've just got out of school, and Youth Services is where they're going. So we will hear 2 stories now, and then Michelle from Youth Services will spend a couple of minutes telling us about how they do and what they do. This is homelessness. It is also displacement.
After my mom gave birth to my younger brother, all she wanted to do was go out and party and would leave me, my sister, and 2 brothers with my grandmother. That's when my gram got custody of us and we moved here to Vermont. When we first got up here, we lived in and out of shelters. My grandmother tried her best to provide for us. But as she got older, she felt she needed help. So she found Kern Hatton Homes in Westminster, Vermont. My older brother went into a foster home, and me and my younger brother and older sister attended Kern Hatton in 2002. At first I hated it and was homesick, but I knew it was best for us and my grandmother. Kern Hatton provided everything for us, so it was definitely a good fit. But time went by so fast, and the next thing I knew it was 3 years later and I was graduating from 8th grade. Kern Hatton only went to the 8th grade, so during the last year I looked for a high school I wanted to go to. But it scared me, because I was so used to a small school, and looking at big schools with older students made me nervous. Then one of my teachers had told me about a school in Pennsylvania named Milton Hershey School, so I applied and started that August. It was weird, because I didn't want to go to a big school, yet I decided to go there, and it was one of the biggest ones. In the end, I loved it, at first. Then, 4 years later, I was graduating from high school. So that nervous feeling was coming back, because I had to pick a college to go to. But I realized I wanted to go back and live with my family in Vermont and start working and go to school later on when I was ready. When I moved back, it was the first time actually living with my family. I was happy to be able to relax and not have to do homework. But after a while I got bored, so I got a job, but not too long after I got laid off. So I was bored again and wasn't doing anything. At that time, my younger brother was still in high school, and my sister was attending Keene Beauty Academy. A couple months after that, my grandmother decided she finally wanted her own space, and we didn't have a problem with that. So the plan was for me, my sister, and my brother to stay in the apartment we were in. But my sister felt like she wanted to start something new. So once she graduated, she and my brother moved back to Texas with my mother and some of my other family. I decided to stay because I didn't want to leave my gram up here all by herself. But in order for me to stay, I had to find somewhere to live because my grandmother was moving into a senior living facility and I couldn't stay with her. That left me to be homeless. As everyone was packing to move, I was trying my best to come up with a plan. I really did not want to go to Texas, so I was determined to do what I could to make it work. Then one of my friends told me about Youth Services. So I immediately contacted them and got to work. I had 1 month to find somewhere to live. As it got closer to moving time, I still didn't have anywhere to stay. So I was supposed to stay at the Morningside shelter, but at the last minute, a room was ready for me at the Cobblestone building. It was only a room, but it was better than nothing. While working with Youth Services, I got a job and somewhere to sleep, and hopefully we'll be starting to take classes at CCV in January of 2011. Youth Services motivated me to get my life back on track and made me realize that doing good things and working hard pays off.
What is life? Life to me is breathing, living, and accomplishing, all of which I live up to. I use this font because it simply looks like the way my life feels at the time, wacky. However, it can be bumpy too. I recently became drug-free. My life resembles me as a victim of an alcoholic, which means I'm far from perfect. I was kicked out of my house at age 17, dropped out of high school shortly after, and moved from house to house, couch surfing. That term lives up to what I had done. I was as sure of myself that even being as responsible as I still was struggling to find my own place. The space to live and grow and to become more than I thought I was. Achieving more than my parents ever gave me credit for doing in the first place was what I thought I would never do. I had potential, but not a reliable support system. It wasn't until I was recommended by my sister and friends that I wasn't alone and youth services could help me financially, physically, and for sure emotionally. So it wasn't until this year I decided to check it out. I met with a woman, Michelle, for about a month. We set goals that I could achieve along with applying for apartments that I could rent. In a month, I had accomplished all my set goals and even found an apartment, which they helped me to get into. Excitement is how I felt. Joy is what ran through my veins, and happiness I found within myself again. I couldn't thank them any more for being there for me. They're like my second family and a great support system. I made new companionship with many people there and met bright and intelligent youths who were in similar situations as me. I'm not alone, and I believe in myself more than I ever have. Thank you, Youth Services.
Hi, I'm Michelle Boslin. I work at Youth Services here in Brattleboro, along with a case management staff of 6 other case managers. We serve about 60 youth each month. These are true stories. These are actually both my clients. Gabriella and Carol are 19-year-old youth who live here in Brattleboro. Carol's already started at CCV. Actually, since she wrote that piece, she's been started college this fall, and Gabriella is planning on starting in the spring. And when we started working with both of those young women, as you heard in their stories, they didn't have a stable place to stay. I can't say that all of our stories end up having endings like that. These were particularly happy endings, I think, in the stories that we hear at Youth Services. But they're very typical ones. I think a lot of times people think about homelessness or displacement, and they don't think of 15 or 17 or 20-year-old youth that are living here in Brattleboro. They don't think when they walk down the street on Main Street and they see somebody walking around that they might not have had anything to eat that day and they don't know where they're sleeping that night. And some of my clients that I work with right now still don't have a place to stay. I have a client who has a dog and she can't find an apartment that will rent her a place with her dog. So she's staying in a tent while she's waiting to find that apartment. So the story of the dog, I mean, the dog can be a huge comfort for a person, and yet it also can make things really complicated. And the thing that we do at Youth Services is we try to look at each young person, figure out what their challenges are, figure out what kind of goals they want and need, and then we help them figure out a way to reach those. No one is forced to work with us in the case management team. We work with youth who either are homeless or who are at severe risk of becoming homeless. And our hope is to prevent them from becoming homeless or to get them to transition from unstable housing to stable housing through subsidies and incentives and regular meetings, helping connect them with services, helping them find jobs, helping them acquire education, and a whole range of other types of things, health services as well. It is a really large problem. I mean, I actually have only recently, within the last year, started working at Youth Services in the homeless youth programs, and I was not aware of the level of the problem until I started doing this work. But Youth Services does really great work. I'm not speaking for myself, I'm speaking for the agency. They do important things, and I'm really grateful to be part of that team, and grateful that New England Youth Theater has given the opportunity to bring some funds in, because we are able to help, literally, we help house youth through funds that come in from the community and from other grants. So thanks for coming, and if you hear about any other programs through youth services, please check them out. We welcome help from the community. Thanks.
I wanted to tell the story of my family, my mother's family, migrations, which were many, starting with my grandfather at the age of 13 and up through the beginning of World War II. I'm going to read a couple of things, and these are from my aunt's book, my mother's oldest sister, of Family Stories, Travels Beyond the Shtetl, which actually there's a copy of in the room with the memorabilia if anybody wants to look through it. The Bundist. In the fall of 1905, my father, at 13, was wanted by the Tsar's police. As member of the Jewish Socialist Bund, his parents whisked him off to Bremen overnight and sent him on a freighter to America. Around his neck, he wore a tag with the address of Uncle Joseph in Reading, Pennsylvania. The telegram announcing his arrival went astray when 2 weeks later he landed in New York. No one was there to greet him. He found his way to Reading, and coming off the train, he spotted an ice cream sign above a shop window. He took it for a Jewish name pronounced Eats Crumb. The shop belonged to an Irishman, but a Jewish customer, a junk dealer, spoke Yiddish. He offered him a cone and took him on his cart to Uncle Joseph's haberdashery. His uncle did not welcome him with wine and cake. Without delay, he set him down to work. Microphones and page turning are tricky. For a cot in the cellar and a pauper's pay, the boy slaved all winter from 4 in the morning till late at night. He kept the furnace going, scrubbed the floors, charmed clients, dealers, took care of deliveries, but he ate in the kitchen with the servants, receiving no kind word lest he asked for a raise. By spring, he knew the language and the trade. With savings, he brought ties, belts, garters, and a peddler's tray, and took himself to New York without goodbyes. There he peddled his way from door to door. For 10 cents a night, he slept in dormitories with Bowery bums as bedfellows. And for the price of a beer, the pubs offered chips, pickles, pretzels, and nuts, of which he made his meals. When winter came, freezing, undernourished, he caught pneumonia, fainted in the street, and, picked up by police, he was returned to Reading. The uncle had spent sleepless nights after the disappearance of his brother's son and loss of his best worker. This time he greeted him with open arms and nursed him back to health. A contract guaranteed good pay and normal hours, and he was graciously admitted to the table. Hardworking, bright, and trustworthy, he grew to be his uncle's mainstay. But lonely for his family, the shtetl, and a sweetheart he had left behind, he soon decided to go home. 2 years before, he had set out a revolutionary gymnasiast, that's a high school student, a bundle on his back, a tag around his neck. He now returned in a bright checkered suit, white pointed shoes, and tilted straw hat. Loaded with gifts and new American speech and sparkle, he tap danced off the boat, took a deep breath, and in full voice gave forth the song of Yankee Doodle. The two had come to town. Now this is just the basic migrations, starting with that first one that I read about, and going on during World War I. The family lived in Lithuania, in a town called NEYT. In World War I, Lithuania was invaded by the Germans, and they fled to Russia to avoid that occupation. As capitalists and Jews, no longer a socialist, nobody's favorite in Russia, in 1921 they returned to NEYT, which at that point was, I think, independent. Lithuania keeps changing, Polish, Russian, German, and occasionally independent. Either out of fear of pogroms or to take advantage of business opportunities, I'm not sure which, in 1923 the family emigrated to Berlin, where my grandfather worked for a major German chemical conglomerate, IG Farben, which became, I think, one of the 5 or 6 largest companies in the world. With Hitler gaining popularity and power in 1930, on inside information from I.G. Faber, they emigrated to Lausanne, Switzerland. Fearing, and then there's some moving around within Switzerland, and back to 1930, up to 1938, when Germany invades Poland, invades Austria. And my grandfather starts to figure out how to get the family out of Europe altogether. He recruited a relative that was a young man living in South Africa who had lived with the family when he was going to university. Brought him back from South Africa and had him be the legs that traveled throughout Europe, getting the entire extended family out of Europe, while my grandfather made all the arrangements and bribed whoever he had to get that to happen. Nobody of the extended family was left at the beginning of World War II in Europe. My mother's family directly left in March of 1939 with the invasion of Poland being in September of that year, just a few months later. Now I'd like to read another segment of a story. No, I'm sorry. Public speaking isn't my shtick. I asked my mother about her academic history, which I knew had been, as you might imagine from that travel log, spotty. And she sent me an email, and I wanted to read the email. She was born in Berlin. First grade in Berlin, 3 different elementary schools in French in Lausanne, primarily L'École Supérieure des Jeunes Filles. At 11, the last year of elementary school in Zurich, now in German and learning Schweizerdeutsch on the playground. At 11, I flunked the oral exam that separated college-bound kids from others and spent 2 miserable years in a municipal secondary school. Now 14, we returned to Lausanne in 1938. I spent a summer in a Jewish boarding school, La Ramée, then was allowed to re-enter L'École Supérieure des Jeunes Filles, a college-bound school. There I had to catch up through the second year of Latin and first year English with private lessons. By 1938, my brothers Sam and David had left for college in the US at MIT and Rensselaer. Feeney, the youngest, was in boarding school. Rose, the oldest, was studying at the Sorbonne in Paris. My parents were in a private nursing home in Montreux, where my father was being cured from what was diagnosed as stomach ulcers. I lived alone with a housekeeper in a newly rented apartment in Lausanne. Talk about lonely. When we came to the US, March 1939, we did not have immigration visas and had to spend several months in Montreal, where I went to private school and was totally confused. Upon returning to the US in May, I was refused admittance to Boston Latin School and took private lessons, tutoring me to take college board exams. I aced the boards in French, German, English, and European history. At 15, with only the equivalent of a middle school education, I was accepted on a very late application to Simmons College. They thought I was very bright because I spoke so many languages. I nearly flunked out of my freshman year, but then changed my major and didn't try to take American history again. I ended up with C pluses and Bs. I got married the week after graduation, not quite 20 years old. Writing it down just now, it sounds most confusing, and I've often wondered how I managed to adapt to these changes in language, locale, and local customs as well as I did. While my whole family was unsettled and going through changes, looking back, there was a major change in 1938 after Hitler invaded Austria. From a five-kid family that lived together in Zurich to a dispersed family whose parents were unsettled and siblings managing in various school situations with financial support, but not a whole lot of informed guidance from our loving immigrant parents. There's also quite a few migrations that happened after World War II by choice, not by under pressure. And if people catch me afterwards, I'd be happy to talk about them. I'd like to close with a brief excerpt from another one of my aunt's stories. This is not my immediate family, it's an extended family. and it's a migration from Russia back to Lithuania to avoid the son's conscription in the Red Army. 3 troikas sped in full moon through the crystal night, propelling powdered snow, bright bells, and children's voices. Balloons of many colors floating overhead. The kids had been told that they were going to a wedding so that they wouldn't, their anxiety wouldn't spill the beans at the border. Sing, children, sing, the mothers urged when someone was in sight. 2 horsemen coming from the opposite direction stopped the caravan. What's this merrymaking all about? They shouted. We're going to a wedding, the children chirped, sprinkling them with confetti. A wedding, eh? Here we wage wars, fighting our arse off for the revolution, and you make weddings. Let's have our own, the other soldier roared. What of it, little wench? Come on, get out. Let's have some fun together. He pointed at poor Mendel. His mother had dressed up as a girl to save him from the claws of the Red Army. She held him tight under the blanket, and tears of terror choked her voice. Stop it, she screamed. Don't touch her. She's dying of consumption. Can't you see? She's contagious. That's why the others are in separate sleighs. Actually, they were hiding under the seat because the other boys had already evaded the draft. That did it. Contagious, eh? They stepped back, horror-struck. Go hang yourself with your damn daughter, you old bitch, they swore. May you both burn in hell. With that, they crossed themselves, spat on the snow, and fled. Never were curses taken with more glee. Trembling all over, Gita hugged her son. I almost had a heart attack, she murmured to herself.
Oh my gosh.
I represent the first generation born in America on my dad's side and the second on my mom's. And what I'm going to do tonight is offer you 3 narratives, each written by different people. And I'm going to try and show that my family's stories are ones of true liberation and exodus, but the places they come from cast shadows that extend into my lifetime, my brother's lifetime. So the first thing I'm going to read is from my grandmother as she looks back at herself when she was 10 years old in Belgium with her family, trying to flee ahead of the German advance. So she writes, "We enter Dunkirk amidst crowds of civilians, French troops, and English soldiers. Combined with the rumble of anti-aircraft gunfire, friendly and enemy airplanes overhead, and the general confusion of an army in defeat, I was overwhelmed by the pandemonium of shouting, pushing, and shoving by the immense crowds in the town square. The adults in our group found a small cafe on the square where all 15 of us trooped in and settled at tables. The patron was glad to serve us drinks and snacks, but told us that we were not welcome to linger in his cafe. My father and uncle begged him to let us stay for a few hours while they looked for any way to cross the channel to England. They came back to the cafe gravely disappointed, and at this point, the owner threw us out of his establishment, shouting in French, 'No Jews, no Jews,' and so we trooped back out to the square. The confusion, if anything, was greater than before. My father tried to negotiate some sort of transportation, and he and my uncle again disappeared into the crowd, and by now I was so frightened at the thought of his getting lost amid these thousands of people that I was sick to my stomach but dared not say anything. Miraculously, a little later, I saw my father and uncle in the crowd, and there they were on a horse-drawn wagon already half filled with people. Strangers tried to scramble on, but my father kept them at bay until everyone in our group had gotten up, and we trotted out of Dunkirk to a village many kilometers away. We arrived at a farm that evening and stayed the night. We heard that there had been a severe bombing raid over Dunkirk that same night, that all the people who had sought shelter there had been killed, and the square had been annihilated. So the next thing I'm going to share with you is more towards my dad's side of the family, the Ukraine-Soviet side. But instead of sharing a personal narrative, a story, I'm going to instead read a passage from the book Babi Yar, which was written by Anatoly Kuznetsov. Anatoly Kuznetsov was a Ukrainian boy in Kiev during the war, and he witnessed and documented the atrocities committed by the Nazis and the Soviets. So, without further ado, he writes, "Young people who were born in the 40s, the 50s, and after, who did not live through or see any of this. For you, of course, the tale I have to tell is pure history. You do not like the dry as dust history you were taught in school. I don't like it either. It often seems to be no more than a long list of reigns, dates, and idiotic battles I'm supposed to be impressed by. On top of that, stories of all sorts of horrors, one dirty trick after the other until you are ashamed. Can the history of civilization really be like that? There are some entertaining old gentlemen who never tire of asserting that it is your good fortune to have had your youth in a time of peace, and that the horrors of war exist for you only in books. You listen, and you don't listen. You say you are bored. You say to hell with you and your wars and the chaos in the world which you have brought about and which you cannot deal with. To hell with the lot of you. Well said. I know what you mean. But if, out of my little window, I were to croak at you, be careful. Will you understand me? I will reach out my antenna and try to receive you. I imagine how pleasant it must be, after all, to treat all politics of whatever kind with utter contempt, to dance, to love, to eat and sleep and breathe, to live. God give you strength. The only thing is that I can see from my little window that while some people are busy loving and sleeping, others are busy making handcuffs for them. Why? That's the question. There are so many would-be benefactors in this world, and they are all determined to shower benefits on the whole world, nothing less. And for this, very little is required, simply that the entire world should fit itself into the design that is taking shape, God knows how, in their feeble, complex, tortured minds. They do not scorn politics. They are the makers of policy. They make their own cudgel, and then they bring it down on other people's heads, and in this manner, they put their politics into practice. Careful, my friends. You see, what I am offering you is no ordinary novel. It is a document, an exact picture of what happened. Just imagine that had you been born but one historical moment sooner, this might have been your life, and not something to pick up and read. Fate plays with us as it wishes. We are all just little microbes crawling about the globe. You could have been me. You could have been born in Kiev and Koronyovka, and I could have been you now reading this page. So here's my invitation. Enter into my fate. Imagine that you are living in my shell, that you have no other, and that you are 12, that the world is at war, and that nobody knows what is going to happen next. You were just reading a newspaper in your hands about people who refuse to work. Just now. Right now. Let us go out to the street. The German military flag is flying over the citadel. The Soviet system is finished. It is a warm autumn day, and the weather is good. I read this for the first time when I was 21 years old, so 2 years ago. But I felt on some level that I had known it my entire life, that I possibly could have even written this if I wanted to. There's always been the sort of awareness that who's to say in my lifetime I won't have to get up suddenly in the middle of the night and leave with only a few possessions and with a good pair of boots. Since I was small, my parents imbued my brother and I with a yearning for a lasting home, so to speak. And in the Jewish tradition, that lasting home is the land of Israel. So the last thing I'm going to offer you is part of an email from my brother who a year and a half ago quit his job on Wall Street and moved to Israel, where he now serves in the Special Forces unit in the Israeli army. And after a very grueling week of training, he writes, throughout all of this, you learn a lot, even though you're tired and hungry and haven't changed your clothes. That your squad mates and commander will work hard for you becomes taken for granted. That giving Naphtali or Daniel the end of the peanuts is more satisfying than the calories you would have gotten had you taken the last bite. You learn to bite the dust, and more importantly, you learn to get back up again. How many times I fell and had to stay down in my sweat-drenched clothes in the freezing desert night and just wanted to shut down. And how many times did I find myself on the ground again with the new cuts, cursing the day I became a Zionist. And what did I relearn on the ground as I picked up a handful of the dust I was inhaling? The sand that was caking itself to my sweaty body, the rocks that were marking me up and down with cuts, that the answer to all my questions, the why, how come, what if only, was literally in my hands. It was all about the handful of dirt in my palm. 65 years ago, the most common word associated with the term Jewish was refugee. We had no dirt of our own to which to flee, to which to return, to which we could call home. Because of people who inhale dust, roll in sand, bleed on rocks, burn lactic acid, ignore the pains of hunger, and work through the lack of sleep, there will never again be another Jewish refugee. And what did I relearn as I climbed to the top of a mountain that overlooks Be'er Sheva and saw the lighted view of the city where Abraham once watered his flocks? The words of Bilam the prophet, who was hired by Balak to curse the Israelites in the wilderness, when, instead of a curse, his mouth opened and praised us. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel.
I feel sorry for you. Sorry you weren't born in a nomadic village in Uganda. Sorry you were expected to live. Sorry you weren't born at 2 pounds and you were able to see. Sorry you know who your father is because you weren't born out of an affair. Sorry your family did want you. I feel sorry for you. You didn't face this choice, either to be adopted or else left for dead in a trash can. Sorry that everyone in your family is related. Sorry your older sister's mom didn't die of AIDS. Sorry you never had a nanny who died of AIDS. I feel sorry for you. You haven't been through a civil war with people hacking each other with machetes. You haven't watched a hurricane flatten your neighborhood in the Ivory Coast. Sorry you haven't moved twice to 2 different continents. I feel sorry for you. Sorry you don't own several cows and plots of land in Uganda. Sorry your mom hasn't met the president of Uganda. Sorry she didn't live through the Rwandan genocide. Sorry your sister's uncle isn't on the Supreme Court. Sorry your uncle isn't the Minister of Disaster Preparedness. Sorry you didn't kill a poisonous snake when you were 5. I feel sorry for you. Sorry you haven't traveled to more than 10 countries. Sorry you haven't flown first class. Sorry you haven't stood in both the southern and northern hemisphere at the same time and watched the African sun set in less than 5 minutes. You haven't seen the Serengeti and the wildlife and the hundreds of miles of savanna grass blowing in the wind. I feel sorry for you. You haven't lived my life.
My name is Anna Almuli-Laurent.
I am Alisa Almuli Palmeri.
This is the story of how the people in Amandola saved our family during the Second World War. Before the war, we lived in Belgrade with our father and mother. We had many relatives, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins. Our father and his brother owned a small textile factory, and we lived comfortably in the center of town. We were very happy. Yugoslavia was then a land of many cultures, languages, and religions. Our family had lived there for many generations. We were Jewish, so we went to a synagogue to pray instead of a church. Though our family wasn't particularly observant, we were very proud of our rich and wonderful Jewish heritage. Mostly, we were treated the same as other Yugoslavs until the Germans invaded our country.
My sister was 6.5 years old when the Germans bombed our city. I was 5. It was just past 7 o'clock, the morning of Palm Sunday, when our world, as we knew it, was shattered. For 3 days, the Luftwaffe poured bombs on the open city. At night, the bombers used the light of the burning buildings as a beacon to guide their attacks.
I was so afraid I could not stop shaking, even in the underground shelter. Our father and the other men in the city had gone to fight the Germans. Mostly women, children, and old people were left. During a lull in the bombing, we fled to the countryside. When we came back to Belgrade 2 weeks later, the German army had occupied the city. That's when we learned that the Germans had special laws for Jews.
We couldn't go to school. We couldn't use the telephone.
We couldn't go to the bank and get our money. We could only shop for food at the open market after everyone else had depleted the supply.
We couldn't go out at night. We had to wear yellow armbands that marked us as Jews everywhere we went.
But that was only the beginning of our nightmare.
German soldiers were living in our apartment. A German-speaking Yugoslav had taken over our father's factory. We went to live with relatives. Soon the Germans began taking away Jewish men for forced labor. Then they began killing them. Among those murdered were our Uncle Ivo and our Uncle Leon. Our father was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Germany. It turned out he was lucky. At least he was alive.
The Germans put our Uncle Ika, a doctor, in charge of the segregated hospital where the Jews were now treated, so he was not sent to forced labor. When a friend warned him that the Germans were planning to round up all the remaining Jews, Uncle Ika took action. He obtained false identity papers for our family.
8 of us escaped. My sister and I, our mother and grandmother, our Uncle Ika, 2 aunts, and a cousin. One night, the adults tore off their yellow armbands. Our mother flushed hers down the toilet. Now there was no turning back. The penalty for leaving the house without an armband was death. We took a train from our city, never to return.
It was November 1941, and we were among the last Jews to escape Belgrade. A few weeks later, the roundups began. Our grandmother Matilda and Aunt Edita were were among those locked in a camp in a broken-down old fairground across the river. They had stayed behind to wait for Uncle Leon. We never heard from them again.
After a harrowing month of travel through Yugoslavia and Italian-controlled Albania, we arrived in Italy, where we were placed under arrest. Though Italy was allied with Germany at that time, few Italians shared the Nazis' hatred of Jews. Hitler wanted to kill or exile every Jewish man, woman, and child in Europe. Mussolini enacted laws saying the Jews were different from other Italians. But individual Italians, even those in power, often acted to protect Jews.
We were interned in a small town in the Veneto, where we reported to the police every day. Life during wartime was hard, but it was not so very different for the interned Jews than for the Italian townspeople. The government gave us ration cards, so we had food to eat.
We made some friends, and we were schooled in the kitchen in the house where we were staying. Somehow, we even corresponded with our father in the prisoner of war camp. Our Uncle Ika began treating patients who paid him in chickens, eggs, and other food. In the summer of 1943, the relative calm was shattered. U.S. and English troops invaded Sicily. Mussolini was overthrown. In September, Italy surrendered to the Allies. German troops began pouring into the country from the north. War had found us again. We fled south toward the Allied armies and safety. After several days of travel, once again with false papers, we found ourselves in the train station in a town called Amandola.
Looking back, more than 60 years later, it is hard to grasp how important for us this little town in the mountains would become. For almost a year and a half, the people of Amandola encouraged us to live among them. They gave us shelter, food, and clothing. A few knew we were Jews, many didn't. But anyone could see we were in need, and they didn't turn their backs on us. From the moment we arrived, people reached out to us. First among them was Mr. Giuseppe Brutti, the station master, who saw us as we sat hungry, frightened, and tired in the waiting room. Without hesitation, he invited us to share a meal with his family.
For us, Giuseppe Brutti and his family, his wife Elvira, their children Marisa, Mario, and Giancarlo, soon-to-be son-in-law Nando Farina, and Mr. Brutti's mother, epitomized the good people of Amandola who came to our aid despite the risk to their own safety. Among the many who helped us were Monsignor Eugenio Verdini and Dr. Cesare Apolloni, who with Mr. Brutti convinced us to stay and arrange for food and shelter in the house at Vicolo Deserto number 4.
Don Quinto Roscioli, who hid us in the San Cristoforo parish house after the Genovese cobbler betrayed us to the Germans.
The Tondi, Cruciani, Belli, Piermarocchi, Leccesi, and Antonini families, and so many others whose names we no longer remember, who each contributed their best to care for us.
Our friends Anna Leccesi, Marcella Tondi, and Adele Cruciani, whose friendship allowed us to be children.
Marisa Brutti, Mrs. Bettina Tondi, and Mrs. Rossi Brunori, who advised our Aunt Lea on our homeschooling. For the rest of the war, we remained protected in Amandola and the surrounding countryside. Why did the people of Amandola help us? There were many reasons. among them a sense of Christian charity or a need to express opposition to fascism, but most of all, it was their strong humanitarian spirit which motivated them.
Anyone who suspected we were foreigners could have reported us to the Germans or their Italian sympathizers. Italians caught sheltering Jews faced prison or death. This risk increased in June 1944, when Germans occupied the town.
Our secret weighed heavy on us, and we feared capture, but there were sweet moments too.
I remember celebrating Christmas in Amanda.
I remember opening the door in the middle of winter and finding a basket with food.
I remember hearing my Aunt Ella playing the piano in the Tondi house.
I remember someone fitting me with a pair of new shoes in a store.
I remember my uncle helping the doctors at the local
I remember
hospital.
dressing as an angel and shepherd for the Christmas play.
I remember our education at home and later at the town elementary school.
I remember going to people's homes for celebrations and eating sweets, especially the
And
cicerchiata.
I remember feeling safe for a time.
My sister, who was by now 9, coped with the stresses of war very differently than I did. I was 7.5 when I reached Amandola. Following the traumatic events and real danger surrounding our family, I found myself surrounded by warm, caring, and nurturing individuals, a community which took care of us, and for the first time, I felt safe. I had already given up on the return of my father and a life which I no longer remembered, and decided that the war was really over. Now we could live happily ever after in Amandola, our new home.
Meanwhile, I wrote fictitious letters to my father, clinging to the hope that one day we would all be reunited, a family again, and back in our homes. I'm sure this helped me survive those frightening and confusing years. I coped with the present by imagining a bright future. When we lived in Chisholm, I listened to fairy tales. In Amandola, I turned to prayer as I struggled to overcome the horrors of what had befallen us and the fear of what might be. I learned the prayers I heard in church. I prayed at home and went to Mass. I thought that if I really prayed hard, God would end the war and magically return us home with our family and our lives intact.
Finally, in the spring of 1945, the Allied troops liberated us, and we celebrated in the streets with the people of Amandola.
Soon after, we moved to a refugee camp in Bari, where one warm autumn afternoon, a truly miraculous thing happened. We were reunited with our father.
Do widzenia, druże, do widzenia. U životu ima mnogo zla. Svaki korak prati nova patnja. Na ovom svetu sreće nema. Ja svaki korak.
And in 1952, 7 years after the war ended, and 11 years after we first arrived, we left our beloved Italy, our adopted country, with a heavy heart, and we moved to America.
We never forgot how the people of Amandola stepped forward in our time of great need. They were human in an inhuman time. They risked their own safety to help us. They saved our lives, and had it not been for the people of Amandola, none of our children and grandchildren would be here today.
I'm Miriam Almuli Porter, and I want to thank you, Amandala.
Voglio onorare il vostro coraggio e ringraziarvi per la vostra amicizia.
Tante grazie, Amandala.
Da tutti noi, grazie Amandolesi.
Grazie Amandala.
Grazie Amandala.
Grazie Amandala.
Grazie Amandala.
Thank you Amandala.
Thank you Amandala. Grazie Amandala.
È tutto. 谢谢 Amandala.
谢谢 Amandala. Thank you Amandala. Thank you Amandala.
Grazie Amandala.
Per tutti i nostri amici e Amandala, grazie per tutto.
Noi vogliamo ringraziare tutti voi.
Vorrei esprimere la mia più sentita gratitudine agli abitanti di Amandola.
Thank you Amandala. Adios.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci. Arrivederci.
I just want to make sure to thank all of you for allowing us to share this wonderful moment in our life, and especially the hope that it generated in our lives, to be able to go back to Amandola and thank the people that helped us through this horrible time in our life. Anyways,
I just want to say that for us, this is a story of hope. It's a story that epitomizes how an individual or a family can, with a simple act of courage and just wanting to reach out to another person, can make such a difference in the life of not only one family, but of so many others. It takes just one act of courage of an individual to make a difference. And everyone who presented so far and all the others who are going to present are epitomize the same thing, acts of courage. This story, I just want to say, is for every one of you to take. We bring you this story hoping that it will give you an impetus to do something that you may not have thought of doing, to inspire you or to inspire others. It's a story for you, Isaiah. Where are you? And for all your cousins and for everyone here, all the
When last seen on the screen, he was about that high, and here he is, Isaiah Palmieri. The two organizations who are not here tonight telling us about their services, it's because they're doing the same thing elsewhere, but it's the Community Kitchen of Keene. I hope I've got that right. You folks are from Keene, okay. And the ServiceNet Greenfield Family Inn, which in particular has an enormous network of services that they provide of finding housing, finding jobs, finding legal advice, dealing with everything from young children to old folks. And all three of these organizations we've heard from today and in supporting are doing this. The sort of work that we just saw here, except they're doing it in our own locality. And yes, it's needed here just like it was there. It's just amazing to see. we've heard a lot about loss. We've heard about loss of home country, of a dog. Loss is one of those things which, to the other person, to the outsider, okay, so somebody lost their home in England and they had to go wherever. Tough. So he lost a dog, one can get another one from the pound. Big losses, small losses, it's the person who suffers, experiences the loss. Whatever it is, to them, it can be catastrophic, cataclysmic, enormously important. And we can't judge how we would react in that situation. If there is one thing we have to cling to and it is taken away from us, it can affect us enormously.
Well, this little story is called Betrayal, and I've been writing just short stories, traumatic, meaningful, and unforgettable. And here is one of them, Betrayal. Inge was my favorite. Her face was pink with red cheeks, small red lips, eyelids that opened and closed. Her arms were flexible so that she was able to sit or stand, raise or lower her arms. She could say, "Mama." I spent hours touching and braiding her soft hair. It was actually my mother's hair that she cut off long ago and saved until she attached it to Inge's head later, just for me. I love my mother. I love my mother's hair, and I loved Inge. My precious Inge. I proudly took Inge on outings in my doll stroller, had been used for Baby, my other doll. Now that I had Inge, Baby got very little attention from me. Oh, I would occasionally change her clothes, give her a bottle, put her to sleep at night. But Baby didn't have any hair to comb. She couldn't say "Mama," and her limbs were not flexible. When I was 9 years old, we had to leave our native Germany. Commotion and anxiety prevailed as we packed certain essentials to take on this trip. My mother and I would first go to Berlin, where we would stay with Aunt Hulda. We would wait for my father to make all the necessary arrangements so we could emigrate. After that, he would join us in Berlin. I had my little suitcase, a few other packages, and my 2 dolls. Suddenly, I was afraid. What if I was not able to take proper care of Inge? If I dropped her and her porcelain face broke? So I asked my father, to take care of her and bring her to Berlin when he joined us there. It seemed a long, long time before my father finally arrived in Berlin. I ran ahead of my mother to greet him. "Where is Inge?" His face fell and he glanced at my mother as though looking for help. "What did you do with Inge? Where is she? You promised to take care of her. Where is she?" And now my tears started to roll. My father looked crestfallen, and turning to my mother, he tried to explain that he was trying to close the house, selling the last pieces of furniture. A man had shown interest in buying the chandelier, but only if he could take the doll for his daughter. "You sold Inge? You sold my Inge? How could you?" Now I was sobbing inconsolably. My mother tried to soothe me and to explain to me how important it was to get us out of Germany. "I don't care," I sobbed, addressing my father. "You lied to me. You sold my Inge. You're horrible, horrible. I hate you."
This is a story of my grandfather, Leon Auerbach, one that he used to tell me often. And by often, I mean every other weekend growing up. He was very, very proud of being able to generously support his family after a rough beginning here in this country. He was also very hard of hearing, so we sort of thought he told this story and many jokes over and over because it was difficult to participate in the conversation. We shall see. But in any case, I loved his stories. So let's hear the story in his words. My father, Abraham Auerbach, owned a pub and had a large house in Kishinev, Ukraine. And Kishinev had about 125,000 people, almost half of which were Jews. And before I was born, in the years before I was born, anti-Semitism swept across Russia. In 2003, in Kishinev, were the famous Kishinev pogroms. They were anti-Jewish riots, and mobs of people burned, looted, raped, and killed, and 49 Jews were dead at the end of 3 days, and nearly 2,000 families were homeless. 2 years later, in 2005, again there were pogroms, followed by a failed revolution where 3,000 Jews died. And my father had a very tough decision. He owned this pub, and the Cossacks came in and said that he needed to give them drinks, and that if he didn't give them drinks, they would burn the pub, his house, rape his wife, his daughter, and kill them. So he gave them drinks, and they continued on their rampages. In the years to come, things got worse. My brother, my older brother, and my older sister fled to America, and eventually my father decided that we too should leave Russia. So we went to an uncle of mine, my stepmother's brother, and he was a Zionist in Odessa. And Odessa was the birthplace of Zionism. People were very interested in seeing Jews act up and not take this quietly and get out of Russia. So we left. We were able to leave Odessa on a ship, and we went to Palestine. And we were there. We lived there for several months. But then the war broke out, and this was World War I. And so the Turks controlled Palestine, and they were fighting the Russians. And so the Turks deported all of the Russians from Palestine. So we were able to take a British battleship to Egypt, to Alexandria, Egypt. And along the way, we lost my stepmother. I don't know where she went. My father went to the authorities and tried to find out where she went, but he spoke Russian and they spoke English, and there was no language, so they could not find out where she was. Now, my grandfather loved a good story, and he didn't like to focus on the negative. And however, my grandmother was tired of this story. She was tired of all stories having to do with leaving Russia, and she would get particularly impatient when he got to the part about losing the stepmother. You did not just lose her. Something happened. It's not funny. So one time, at some point, I wrote up this story for my grandfather, and he shared it with his brother. And his brother Saul said, "Leon, how could you get it so wrong?" And Saul explained that my great-grandfather, Abraham Auerbach, was a brutal husband, and that my stepmother didn't want to go with them, and that she hid and stayed in Palestine. But this is my grandfather's story, so let's continue. After a few months living as refugees in tents in Egypt, my father went to the Russian consulate and asked for a visa to come to America because his son and his daughter were already there. And the Russian consulate said, "I can't give you another visa. You have to go back to Russia." But my father, he did not accept this. There was a well nearby with a staircase to the well, and he said to the consulate, "If you don't give me a visa, I'm going to drop myself into the well." And he threatened to commit suicide. "Then, if you don't give me the visa, you will have to send the children anyway to America, and so you should just give us the visa." So apparently this bluff worked because they gave him the visa. And this was in June of 1915. So 2 weeks later, we couldn't go straight to America. We had to go to Greece. So we left for Greece, and we took a week to get to Greece. And when we got there, we boarded the Thessaloniki in Piraeus. And it took us, there were 1,900 of us in steerage on the boat to America. And it took us 54 days to get to America. At some point, we were stuck in Bermuda. I didn't even know we were in Bermuda. I don't know how long we were in Bermuda. But on August 30th, 1915, we made it to Ellis Island in New York. And my name was Leova, but they changed it to Leon. They couldn't read our names. They didn't know our names. My younger brother, who was 8 at the time, was Hulim, and they made him Saul. My older brother, who was 12, was Samuel, and he got to stay Sam. And my father, Abraham, was 58 at the time. So again, an uncle, our uncle, came and picked us up with my brother and my older sister, and they picked us up and brought us to the Bronx. And we stayed with them. I was 10 by this time, so they put me in elementary school, and I had to learn English quickly. We moved all over the Bronx because we stayed with my sister. And whenever she got a job cleaning a new family's house, we moved with her. So eventually, my brothers and my father and I got our own apartment in the Bronx. And still, my brothers and I shared a bed, and we did not have much to eat. We would earn extra money. We would go on rainy days to the train station to meet the businessmen who did not want to get wet. And we would charge them 5 cents if they let us share the umbrella with them as we walked them through the rain, and 10 cents if they kept us out in the water. Getting wet. When I was 16, I worked for a company that made samples for the ready-to-wear industry. And this was 1921, so wages were low. I made $10 a week. And in the evenings, I went to high school. But after 2 years, I decided I had it, and I applied for a job with the Eagle Pencil Company. There, I really enjoyed my work. And after a time, I was able to move up in the ranks and become manager of the ordering department. And during this time, I got a lot of experience and the information I needed to go on the road as a traveling salesman. So I convinced them to give me a car. They did not know I didn't know how to drive. Talk about a crash course. So after 3 months of driving through the Carolinas and Georgia, well, I knew how to drive, and I came back home, and I continued to work for the Eagle Pencil Company for a time. But eventually, my brother and I started our own advertising business, and we placed line ads in the back of the New York Times and magazines, and I managed that company until I was 79. But back then, over the summers, we would go up to the Catskills, to the Pines Hotel, and enjoy the leisure and the comedians and flirting with the pretty girls. One weekend, my future wife came up, and after that weekend, she came up every weekend, and I went back every weekend, and we courted. She lived in Brooklyn, so during the year, I would come back and I would go and visit her until I convinced her to marry me. Now, her family wanted us to wait because her older sister was not yet married. But eventually, we decided to quietly go ahead. And the rest of that story is for another time.
As you can probably imagine, one of the great joys of this enterprise over the last few weeks has been meeting all of the people who responded to our outreach about joining us tonight and sharing their experiences. And we asked for stories, and everyone who came to us wanted to tell their story in their own voice. And we've had a wonderful cornucopia of voices tonight, including motion pictures, as well as simple, straightforward storytelling. And the next presenter, Kate Tarlow Morgan, came to us with the desire to express her story in her own medium, and we were delighted with it and enchanted, and I know you will be too. So please welcome writer and choreographer Kate Tarlow Morgan with her story.
Well, I don't know the towns that my family came from. I only have stories. great-grandfather, Samuel Waloshinsky, was conscripted into the Russian army in the 1880s. He was a drummer boy. And he rode on the shoulders of a giant. One day, the giant decided to go AWOL and ran into the forest with Samuel on his shoulders. They ran to the Black Sea and jumped on a boat to America. On a piece of paper, Samuel had a paper that said Fleischmann's, Lafayette, Indiana. So he bypassed New York City, got on a train, and went out to the Midwest. In those days, the trains had these wooden handles that you could open the doors yourself. So when the train was coming in over the Wabash River Bridge, the conductor came through and said, Lafayette, Indiana! Samuel opened the door and fell off the Wabash River Bridge, 200 feet. And he survived, but he lost his sight. He raised his family in Streator, Illinois, and changed his name to Wolf. her suits hanging on the door in my den. You may come by for them this week. The black and white seersucker must be returned as is, but the blue and white can be refitted, and you can have it for your own. Love, Dad.
So why do I not look like a Paraguayan? Do I? Do I sound like a Paraguayan? My son, who was born in Brattleboro Hospital, our son, sorry, he says, "Pops, you're not a Paraguayan." And I say, "What are you?" He says, "I'm an American." Why? "Because I was born here." "Okay, thank you. I'm a Paraguayan. I was born in Paraguay." "But you don't look like Paraguay." "What does a Paraguayan look like?" So anyway, that's a short way of saying that my story actually is my story and my ancestors' story, just like all of the others, or most of them have been. It also comes out of the whole European World War situation. I could go on for 10 minutes, which I'll try. Otherwise, it'll be 10 days, so we don't have that time. So I'll give a thumbnail of it and why it relates to what we have been doing this evening. Out of the mess of World War I, those of you who know your history know the Treaty of Versailles and how it really nailed Germany to the floorboards and left a very large and disillusioned population of young people, old people as well, everybody all over Europe. But there was a particular German youth movement which went into two totally distinct ways. One went into the Hitler Youth, the other one went into the there was almost a cult of wandering the countryside, sort of semi-religious, semi-hippie, a bit like the 60s up here in Vermont. A real sort of freedom from responsibility for any of the institutions of the state that had been behaving so disastrously. Out of that particular movement came a Christian pacifist organization called, well, they had many names. They came out of the Hutterite Anabaptist movement of 1500s. And long and short is that they established a commune, what we would call in this country a commune, and it's about the best word that I can think of. It's also called an intentional community. Intentional community in the sense that here we are, this is a place, this is where we live and live our beliefs, and we are a community of property. Everything you own when you join us in full membership, you leave here. If you ever leave because things aren't working out, you leave without what you brought. There is no mine or thine, and boy did I violate that often. I even got kicked out eventually at the age of 18 because I forgot that there is no mine or thine. There is only an ours. So anyway, they established as a Christian pacifist community in Germany in the 20s, early 30s. And then there was the rise of Hitler, 32, 33, and of course such a community that was pacifist, that would not participate in any of the institutions of the state, was not allowed to exist. So they were given the choice of imprisonment or leaving. So they left very quickly Liechtenstein and then England. which seemed really hunky-dory until 1939 when war broke out. And suddenly there were these 150, 200 very German people living in the English countryside with quite a large number of English people who had joined for the same reasons. They saw war coming, they were pacifists. They weren't quite the religion aspect of it. The religion aspect got dicey a bit later on. My parents, my father was 17 or 18. He was the first Englishman after World War II was declared to get complete exemption from military service based on his testimony to a tribunal. He did not plead a religious thing. He just pled, I cannot kill, I cannot shoot, I cannot do alternative service in the military because that would free somebody else to shoot a gun or drive a tank or whatever. So anyway, he and my mother, who was 4 years older than he, they joined as two people engaged to be married. And suddenly, when the German air raids started over England, somebody said, uh-oh, we've got a couple of hundred Germans over here and all these English people and living out in the boonies on the farm and all very hunky-dory, but they could be calling in bombing raids. They could be sending secret coded signals. We can't have that. And you can understand why the English government couldn't deal with that. So again, the whole group were given the option of being interned for the duration of the war or leave. And they opted to leave, but where can we go? And the English government was very quick to organize through the Hutterian and Mennonite networks, which are all over Canada and the Dakotas and South America and Paraguay. Paraguay is this country in the middle of nowhere. George Bush now owns 2 million acres of it, and I don't know what he's going to do with it. He'll have to hire Moses to kill the rattlesnakes there because there's a lot of them. So anyway, Paraguay offered asylum to this. At this point, there were 37 nationalities, almost all European, some Russians as well, in this group of about 300 people. And they were offered asylum to Paraguay, no military service, and given a chunk of 20,000 acres, which sounds a lot here, but it was a dot on the map over there. The idea for the Paraguayan government being that they had just lost 2 wars against a total of five countries, and there were almost no able-bodied males left in the country. And they needed to develop the country, develop agriculture, exports, and so forth, and they saw European enterprise and innovation coming in. They didn't know about our religion. So anyway, there was a piece of land, there was a country. How to get there? Big ocean. It's wartime. These submarines are attacking civilian shipping. So they have this real dilemma. Do they go in a ship, in a convoy, which is being protected by military naval vessels? And those naval vessels will shoot to kill any German submarine or other craft that they will see. They finessed that one, and they went in a series of boats, and if you'll see in my museum pictures there, it's a really bizarre story because unlike the steerage stories we've heard from some other people, they were given an ocean liner or the top 2 decks of an ocean liner, and there were all of these people, the men all in big beards, and they wore black coats with hook and eye rather than buttons. I don't know what the religious thing about the buttons was, but again, that came from the Hutterians, and I think the Amish, some of them do that. And a couple of smallish groups went ahead. The group that my parents went with in late 1940, I believe, was about 180 people. And there are all of these women, these men in the big black beards, and all of the women in long dresses, aprons, spotted kerchiefs, looking like a casting call for Sound of Music or something. I mean, really a very distinctive costume, and to this day they wear it. And they get on this ship, and they're traveling, well, first class. and they sit with the captain at the table, and they get this amazing food. It's not that they're paying for this. The British government was delighted to find a ship that would take them and get rid of them, get rid of that problem. So they dodged across the North Atlantic and down the North American coast, and eventually found their way by various means up the Paraná and then the Paraguay River into this hellhole of a Chaco, which is the left side as you're going up. So it's the west side of Paraguay, which is split almost exactly evenly between east and west by the Paraguay River, which none of you probably have heard of, but if you went 1,500 miles upstream from the ocean and sat in the middle of the Paraguay River, you couldn't see either side. It's that wide. It's 5-10 miles wide and very low lying on both sides and very humid, so you don't have great clarity and visibility. And there these folks decamped into the bush, and the Mennonites with their horse-drawn wagons, ox-drawn wagons, made them welcome. Brutal, brutal conditions in terms of heat and disease and infant mortality and all of that. They then found a really nice piece of land over on the other side, on the nice side of the river, and moved there. And that was the piece of land that actually, in my story I should have said that was found later on. So that was where they really went. That was the promised land, 20,000 acres of pretty good land. And to me, to us, Janet and myself, as children growing up there, we were both born there. Of course, I was born in 45, and this all happened in 1941 that they moved there. And it was in many ways a paradise, and the native Indians call it El Eden Guarani, the Guarani paradise. Guarani were the Indians who lived there and still live there. And so how does this all relate? Well, obviously it was a forced exodus, force of circumstances, all of these people. There was the religious aspect, which fed, in most cases, the pacifist aspect, which was we do not do war, we do not do violence, we do not bear arms, we do not do anything that frees someone else to do that. We just don't do it. It's total pacifism. Not a very popular concept, and which is why probably Paraguay, which may have had its fill of wars at that point, decided that they were happy to take us on those terms. So we spent 20 years in what we call the jungle. It really wasn't a tropical jungle, but it was a pretty amazing place with amazing fauna and flora. Fairly brutal weather, but the winters weren't too bad. We had horrendous problems with childhood diseases, with glaucoma, with childbirth, stillbirths, and so forth. Being of that fundamentalist Anabaptist sect, their way of increasing numbers was the easy one. We have a baby every year. Over there in the museum, you'll see pictures of two of my aunts who, one of them had 12 children and the other had 11. Our family was maybe the youngest with 4, right? I don't know what mom and dad were doing, but they weren't doing the right things. And so it grew exponentially from those early beginnings because of all of these babies. And what it did not grow from was any kind of accretion or input from the native population. They couldn't understand what the hell we were doing. Meantime, we were getting interest from, guess where? The United States of America. This has got to be a good deal. Let's take it over. And that's sort of the way it looked to us, because it was suddenly a wealthy American joined, and suddenly all the women could wear ordinary clothes, because this lady was not going to wear that sort of clothing. So she liberated the women almost overnight to being able to wear ordinary clothes, which was quite a revelation for them. So the final part of the diaspora was that there was an enormous internal tumult, which often happens with these cults because they're based on charismatic leadership. Charismatic leadership works so long as you're alive, but when you're dying or dead, then someone else has to become the charisma. And if it's nepotism all the way, then you start thinning out the blood, and all of those Caesarean disasters happen. So the conclusion was that we could survive there, but we couldn't prosper in the evangelical and spreading the good word to everybody that we wanted to. So it was decided that we had a crisis, and about half of the people left and scattered back, some of them into the jungle and some back to England and America and Germany and other places. And our branch of the family came to this country, and then the rest of it is going to be some other evening story. But the point here is that as we were going into 1945, 46, when I was born in 45, but as a smallest child, I was aware of the beginnings of the influx of what we call the DPs, and they were the displaced persons from all over Europe who were coming out of the war and being shipped down all over South America, but particularly Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina. And we got our fair share of them, and we got money eventually through the German government for housing these people and taking them on, because the German government had to do this huge reparations thing. And so the first dentist I remember was Dr. Popov, and he was Russian. And if you want to know what kind of an experience having him as a dentist, you'll have to come and see Fiddler on the Roof, where they have a sewing machine where the sewer does this with their foot to make the wheel go round and round. Well, try to imagine. Which was early dentistry, of course, with no anesthesia. So that may be an unfair memory of my first Russian, but it's a very dull one. Russians, a few Jewish people, but they didn't last well. They discovered Uruguay was much more habitable than where you were. Right? Uruguay was much more civilized than where we were. But amazing, I have Czechoslovak uncle married one of my aunts, and this polyglot of people. My first language in school through 7th grade, I think, was German. So my first language basically was German. I have 2 older sisters and a considerably younger one. And it was not at all unusual for us at the table with my parents, or English, for us my older 2 sisters and I speaking German, and then switch to English for Mom and Dad and Janet. And so there we are in a Spanish-speaking country, and German is the language, and English is being taught as a second language, and then we switch to the other way around, and then we switch to Spanish as the way the school is taught, and English and German being spoken as taught as languages. Fascinating experience of all of these different nationalities trying to do exactly the same thing, and that just doesn't work. You know, we all have different gods, we all have different backgrounds. I thank you again so much from all of us at NEYT for coming. This has been quite a revelation, I think, for all of us.